So the reason why I wanted to talk about MIDI tonight is because a few weeks ago, BandLab put out a post asking people where all the keyboardists were at and whether they preferred MIDI or synths and which one and why. Now, I found this question to be a little unusual because you can't do MIDI without a synth, and a synth is pretty useless if it's not a MIDI synth. But they got hundreds and hundreds of replies from people saying they like MIDI for this reason or synth for that reason. Um, and other than a few people who noticed like this was a bizarre question, the way that they questioned it, most people seem to think that MIDI is some form of sound. Um, that's the biggest misconception when it comes to MIDI is that it has anything to do with sound. MIDI isn't a sound format. MIDI is control data. It's like sheet music. You wouldn't say sheet music sounds like something. Sheet music is sheet music, and somebody plays the music from the sheet with an instrument. MIDI's the same thing. And a lot of people seem to think that it is sound. And that's why you hear them say, oh, well, MIDI sounds more electronic, or in some cases, some people think MIDI is fake. It doesn't sound natural. MIDI's not the reason why something would sound natural or not. What would make something sound natural is the synthesizer that you use with MIDI. So, for anybody out there who has wondered what MIDI is, we're going to talk about what MIDI is and what MIDI isn't. And I'm going to show you some examples of the same track, both in MIDI and as an audio file, and you'll see there is no difference between the sound. The difference is in what the track data actually is. So this is the post that BandLab actually put up. I'm gonna put this over into the chat for anybody who wants to check it out. And it's an interesting conversation going on there. I was a little surprised that it came from BandLab with that question, but hopefully BandLab wants to know more about what MIDI is too. So I hope they get back with me also. Now, what I'm going to bring up here is a track that I've been working on. A lot of people ask me how I do my tracks because I cover a lot of songs and I use these MIDI files. I start with the MIDI file, I bounce the tracks, I mix them up in Cakewalk, and then hopefully the final product sounds either like the song or sounds good. Um, Otherwise, if you just play MIDI raw, you don't get uh, um, the same kind of sound. Matter of fact, before I play this, here is the original MIDI file for this song. This is Queen, We Are the Champions. And I got this from, in this case, you go to Google, you search for the band, the song name, just add the words MIDI. Most songs, you're going to find at least a couple of MIDI files out there. In the case of this song, there's 3 or 4 different variations out there. I went and picked a variation that I liked, and I think it's this one. Matter of fact, let's see if we can hear this. Could you hear that, Ange?
Sounds good.
Okay, so that's the MIDI file that I started with. Strings are pretty insanely loud in it. The patches that it's using are just the general sounds that are built into the Windows operating system in this case. Not a very fancy synthesizer, but it does have all the parts necessary. It's got the piano part, it's got the string part's actually the vocal melody, and it's got the bass. For this song, those are pretty much the most important tracks. And if I jump over to cakewalk here. This is the project that I was working on, mixing this. And up here in the top half are my MIDI tracks. And I'm going to show you one of the MIDI tracks. Here's the piano for this by itself. So you can hear how the piano track is its own track. It's nice when you want to be able to hear just one instrument. If you're trying to learn a part, MIDI is very helpful for learning as much as it is for playing with. Now, I'm going to open this track up here and zoom in so that we can take a look at what MIDI looks like. You'll notice this does not look like your typical waveform. Usually when you're looking at audio tracks, you see waves, just like what you're used to seeing in BandLab. You see the waves go up, you see the waves go down. That's not what MIDI is, because MIDI is not sound. MIDI is notes. Every dot you see here represents a note being hit, or in this case, two notes, two notes, two notes. And there's these little dots that are actually sustain pedals. Just like MIDI can keep track of what note you hit, it can also keep track of how hard you hit it, how long you hold on it, all the same things you would see in sheet music. MIDI has a control event to do the same thing. Now, I'm going to go down to this audio track of this piano track so we can compare what we see here to what the audio track looks like. And this is the track that I bounced of that piano track. Now, this looks like an audio track. I'll bring it up. We'll zoom in here. This is what you're used to seeing when you're looking at audio. That's an audio wave, and it should sound pretty close to. Now, the only additional thing you hear there is a little bit of echo and a little bit of effect that I gave this audio track. But the whole procedure to mix this MIDI song into my own mix, into this audio track, is to go through each of these instrument tracks and bounce each track to an audio track. Because with MIDI, you can't add the normal effects that you might use. I use a reverb, I use a little tube preamp. All those things can't be applied to a MIDI track because a MIDI track doesn't have sound. So you can't use an audio effect on a non-audio track. So by bouncing each one of these tracks, I bounce the bass track, I bounce the piano. There's two piano tracks. There's actually a couple of different guitar tracks that I chopped up and took different pieces so that I could play with different guitars. Usually I'll arrange things and rearrange things. That's the beauty with MIDI, is you have all the parts. You have a synthesizer that will play it exactly the way the part says to be played, and you have the luxury of being able to chop things up, and if you really want to, you can transpose them. I transpose my tracks all the time. I'll take a bass track and I'll bring it up an octave. In the case of this is a viola, and this is the bass track, but it's played an octave higher. So it gives it that. So because I have these different instrument tracks, I can change the sounds that I'm using. I don't have to use the bass sound. I can use a viola in this case and reimagine the track any way I want. We can also do things like slow down the tempo and speed up the tempo, do these mashups that you're always pushing me to do, Ange. It's very useful for that kind of flexibility, because when you change the speed of things, it doesn't change the sound. If you have a wave loop, a drum loop that's just a wave file, you go more than 5 beats per minute up or down, you start to hear the sound distort. With MIDI, the sound isn't made until it starts playing. You can change this. I can go to 50 beats per minute. And the piano still sounds like a piano. If I had done that to the wave track, not so much. Once you drastically change something, wave files really lose their integrity when you stretch or compress them too much. MIDI doesn't even care. You can change the tempo all over the place. It's just going to tell the synthesizer to play it faster or slower. Very useful for that. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to show you what is actually going on this piano track and what MIDI actually is storing. This is what MIDI stores on the track. And if you look at this, you're going to see a lot of note events. These are the actual notes being played. This track is not storing sound. It's just saying hit a C6 for 3 seconds, and the 77 is what they call an expression control. It says how hard to hit that key. So just like versus big difference. Same key, MIDI's just picking up the difference there. And as it plays, you can see now, these are cool. You saw this little wheel shift here. This is where MIDI really gets interesting, because when people say something sounds natural or unnatural, or good or bad in MIDI, the things that make MIDI sound more natural is this wheel programming portamento. There's a whole bunch of controller events that help to make a MIDI track sound more natural. Typically, when you're recording, you're not necessarily doing all those things, especially if you're trying to play a guitar on a keyboard. You can't do the kinds of slides typically on a keyboard. But after the fact, you can enhance the effect to make it do the exact same thing that a guitarist did. And that's how a lot of keyboardists manage to make things sound more natural. Oh, was he asking about Cakewalk?
They were asking what you were using. But Seeds of Righteousness just put a
Yes.
beautiful comment in here. He says, I have an Akai Professional Key 25, and I'm very new to this sort of thing, but it sounds awesome. It's nice to learn about this, and I appreciate you, Tony and Ant, for hosting this lesson.
Oh, that Akai is actually fun too. I think that one has the little 16 pads. You know what? Remember what I was telling you? Like those little 16 pads would complement your beat making. You know how you do your grids and you pick your pads as you do the song? These little physical pads, those Akais, I think the one he's talking about has the like, oh, and he's on Logic Pro. Well, there you go. That's a good one to play with over on the Mac side for sure. You can have a lot of fun with that. If you need some sound seeds, I got tons of cool sounds and stuff that'll make that Akai a lot fun. So what I do when I put up my remasters is what you see here. I start actually up here. These tracks wouldn't exist. These are all ones that get bounced, but I start with these MIDI tracks and I go through each track. I bounce each one to an audio file. In the case of, depending on what keyboard I'm using, the process is pretty much like you solo the track, you make a new audio track, and you set that track to record. You go up to this one and you hit record, and basically it would. So as you can see, it was just basically re-recording that piano track, turning it from the MIDI track, which has no sound, it's whatever sound I want it to be, into an audio track, which sounds exactly like that one. Now, if I said, I don't like that piano, I think I'm going to go with a different piano. I'm going to bring up my Halion synthesizer here, and I'll show you, how you can change your sounds, at least with this synthesizer. Cakewalk comes with an okay synthesizer. It's a good start. Once you start playing with this stuff, you can put much better synthesizers on your computer and you can go nuts. Like this Halion Steinberg synthesizer, fantastic one. If you can get your hands on this, you have awesome sounds. As good of a sound as a $4,000 keyboard would be. So I'm just going to go over to these piano categories. I'm going to say, let's try a different piano. This one's got a nice echoey sound to it, and play that track again. And if I want to keep trying different ones, so as you can see, I can find the exact sound that I want. And then once you do, bouncing that, you now have that track with that sound. And once you have an audio track, that's where the fun really starts. Why my mixes sound the way they do, it's not because of MIDI. In some cases, it's not even because of the sounds that I choose. I mean, I use good synthesizers. I've got two physical Rolands plus this Halion sampler. Those help to make a good sound. They have great sounds. But what really makes the sound is actually once I have the audio track, able to mix them. So you look at these audio tracks here. If I hide the MIDI tracks and I bring up the wave tracks, these are the bounces. And we'll turn this off. These are all the audio tracks. And as you can see, I bounce a lot. So that fretless bass track, I didn't just bounce it once. I bounced it to a fretless bass sound, a cello here. This is a contrabass. We'll take a listen. There's another bass. These are all the same bass track, but they're different instruments. Here's with the piano sound. So as you can see, I got two piano tracks for piano one, two for piano two. Get to the guitars. Sometimes I go nuts with the guitars. There's four different guitar tracks. And again, the effects, the cool thing about having these guitars over here as audio is getting them to sound more authentic. Because, I mean, the starting guitar that I might have might sound okay. Now that's with effects. If I show you here, here's the effects for that track. I'm using a little bit of reverb and this effect. This is actually a guitar preamp, but I use it for other things. And I use this area effect. I'll bring it up here and show you what I'm talking about. because this is one of the best free things that comes with Cakewalk. Cakewalk comes out of the box with some really useful effects in there, and this one is the gold. So this is a guitar preamp with all sorts of different presets for different things, and the one that I like is this airy chords. It serves a lot of different purposes, helps to get a little delay and echo in there when you need it, and it pushes, it sizzles a track. If I want a violin to sound like it's electrified, this effect on a violin or other non-guitar instruments will electrify them. Electrified saxophones and brasses, strings, this is the effect that you want to try with those sounds. You'll really boost them. So this particular track, this guitar track, is sending a little bit of signal to the area effect and a little bit of signal to the reverb, and this is what it sounds like with and without them. So there's the guitar clean with nothing. That's the air. So that's really why it starts to sound better when you go from the Midi, bounce it to the audio, and in the audio track, you can apply these effects. You can use these things on audio tracks, and with a guitar sound like that, a good guitar preamp, it's now it sounds like an actual guitar. It's not a real guitar. It came off of either this Roland or that Halion, but it sounds more like a real guitar because it's running through a guitar processor. That's how you can make things sound more authentic. If people are saying your Midi doesn't sound real, it's not so much because it's Midi, it's because you didn't go this extra mile. And this is what people want to do with their Midi when they go beyond just getting this sound into a track. When you want to actually mix it and produce something with that sound, you want the power of these effects. That's another nice thing, being able to change your sounds. Like even that guitar track, I don't tend to just do this, the instrument that I need to for a track. I will add strings and all sorts of things wherever the hell I feel like it. So that guitar track really needed a string sound. So you get that, you get those options of being able to layer different sounds than you might have normally heard in a song. This is why it's good for people to actually go get a MIDI file, load it up in Cakewalk or load it up in BandLab. Play around with it, change the sounds on it, and listen to the individual tracks. You'll get to know the song, which is the best benefit. I know how to play all these songs now after the last year and a half because I've watched the tracks. If you like to see sheet music, the beauty of MIDI is that if I want to see this track as a piano view or sheet music, the ones who like sheet music, I can bring this up and hell, while I'm bouncing the track, can learn simply by looking. So that's why I say like MIDI is just sheet music. What you see here is just a sheet music version of what's on this track. And for those who don't know how to read sheet music, well, tab, the piano roll, you can look at it this way. This is the way I like to look at it because I understand a keyboard. So when you're looking at a keyboard light up, oh, it should be lighting up, but here you can actually see the dots themselves. Um, this is where those who can't necessarily play an instrument, that doesn't mean that you can't compose, you can't make music, because if you can move a mouse, you can literally click the boxes where in the time, and that's just as effective as playing an actual instrument. For me, it's a little slower. I'd rather just do it on a controller that I'm comfortable with, like a keyboard. But if I had to, I could click it on this grid and I could do the same thing. So never use the excuse that you can't play an instrument as the excuse why you can't make music, because you can paint a song with this screen. And that's another reason to want to learn how to use this MIDI technology in these keyboards, because if you can't learn how to play a guitar or a piano, you can certainly learn how to trigger one just with your mouse. But it does get easier when you have other MIDI controllers. I mean, keyboards are the most common ones, but you have MIDI controllers for everything these days. They've got them for guitars. Paul over here on BandLab, he uses the Roland Aerophone, which is basically like a digital saxophone or a clarinet. I mean, it's actually like 3 or 4 woodwinds with a synth built in. So just about every type of instrument has a MIDI controller equivalent of it these days. And if you record with that, then you are able to notate what you're doing as you play it. Sam asked me how to record his stuff so that we could play around with MIDI. I could change the sounds and things like that. I'm hoping to get with him and show him how to record with MIDI. But what I'm going to do here is I'm going to show you a quick example of like what it's like to record with MIDI, because it's actually no different than recording anything else with audio. So I'm just going to make a new project here.
Is the title name Shh IT?
Yeah, sure. 3 H's. And this is a nice blank project. I'm going to insert a MIDI track. Now this is the difference. Like if I was normally, if you were like plugging in a guitar or a microphone, you would insert an audio track, and the track would expect to record audio. It would record whatever sound you were making on that guitar, and it would record it as an audio wave. I'm not going to record as an audio track. I'm going to record as a MIDI track. So this track is not expecting audio. It's expecting controller data, MIDI data that's going to come when I hit that key, it picks up that I'm hitting that note. So I'm going to turn this off for a second. That way I can get one. Okay. So now if I wanted to record, normally I'd set my time, and whether you want a metronome, me, I'm not a big fan of metronomes, so I tend to turn them off. And we make that enabled. So as you can see, what it recorded here, this is not sound data. This is note data. And I literally just notated what I was playing. So those who think that people who do MIDI aren't necessarily musicians or aren't playing something, this is part of the misconception about MIDI that you'll see all over that forum when people are asked whether they prefer MIDI or a synth. There's a lot of people who think that MIDI doesn't mean playing. I just played that, and it just recorded what I played. It didn't record the sound. If I hit play right now and I don't have a synthesizer, which I don't, this technically shouldn't be even making a sound yet because it doesn't have a synthesizer. Well, it is talking to mine because it's there. But I can change this synthesizer. Oh, I want a different sound. Let's go to this piano sound. So those same notes can play on any sound. Play a guitar. But you don't want to play a sound like that with sustain, because I was holding the sustain pedal, but here's a clean guitar. Gives it a different mood than the piano. And just as easy to play both of them. I could actually, at this point, I would probably take that same part and run it through a chorus guitar like that and a piano, and maybe mix it all up into the nice thing now is you start with a little piece like that, and you can go and turn it into a loop. Bring this down, and as a loop I can say, play this many times. So now, instead of having to play something for a minute and a half, just playing the one part makes it that much easier to go to the next part and repeat. And it's much easier in MIDI to chop and loop like this than it is with wave data. When you're dealing with wave data, you gotta chop very precisely. With MIDI, if assuming that you're playing in time and you do like stick to the proper beats with MIDI, you will always be at the right places when you jump around. The beginning of the measure will be the beginning of the measure, assuming you recorded things properly. If you don't, then timing can be all over the place, but the same with wave audio. So there's no benefit between wave and MIDI in that case, because if you're not using the proper tempos, if you don't set the proper tempos, then you can't use the timeline mathematically because you're not playing in the proper time. So I would encourage people when they make their projects, and if you're making a song, it really does help to figure out like what beats per minute you are doing, because if you just keep it at 120 or 100 and you go do all your stuff and then you want to add more stuff or other people want to add more stuff, uh, changing that stuff after the fact is not a good idea, and sometimes you won't like the results that you get if you change it the wrong way. Stuff can stretch, or BandLab will ask you, at least when you're on BandLab, if you do change the beats per minute, you'll get this pop-up saying, we're about to stretch it, and pay attention to it. Don't just ignore that and say yes. Know what it's doing. Okay, so you know that's MIDI recording in a nutshell. Hopefully, when Sam's got some time, I'll help him get his MIDI keyboard talking to his computer and recording what he's playing this way. Assuming he's not already doing it, he might already be doing it. I still got to check out his tracks and see what he was talking about. But that's what he's looking to do, and a lot of people who are going from the little phone editor and just making beats through the little beat maker, going to this level of MIDI with Cakewalk and these synthesizers, and being able to trigger these synthesizers, whether you're clicking in a grid, whether you're using snippets of MIDI, you can do a scale. You can get a MIDI scale that will play exactly that scale, up and down, up and down. So MIDI can also be used to do complex things that you might not be able to do easily on your own. You can have it doing something like, and just hit one key afterwards. If you're playing that arpeggio and it's playing based on the key that you're holding, then when I hit this, it would be doing. And then if I hit this key, the same arpeggio. And that's what a lot of keyboardists will do is they'll set up different arpeggios and different scales or loops, and then use one key to trigger them and move around in them. And that's useful when you need to be like five hands at once and you're trying to do a bunch of sounds. For the guys who are playing a guitar with a loop box, it's the same kind of mentality. We're going to close this. And just to uh, uh, go over those events that I was talking about with MIDI. MIDI is all about control events. So understanding which events there are is the key to like utilizing the technology and getting it to sound the way that you want. If you're trying to play a guitar sound or a string sound or a horn sound and do a slide or all the fancy things that those instruments can do, knowing these different events here is the key to that. I'm just going to get this share screen out the way. Shane is right about that share bar. That is a pain in the ass when it's right in front of you. So these MIDI events, the ones that are the most obvious and the most used are the first two. These note events, well, the first two are the on and off. You're either on or you're off. And that's how notes start and stop, by those two events. The aftertouch is what gives it the things like the sustain and the release, all the things that go on after you've hit the key, after the touch. The most important one for events is the controller events here. And there's actually a whole sub list of the different controller events. And this is where you get, this is the difference between good MIDI and bad MIDI. You can go get a crappy MIDI file that just sounds flat with no dynamics. Everything's just set at the loudest. There's no controller events. If you get a good MIDI file, will actually contain these controller events here. I'll bring this up. These are the controller events. There they are. So there's a whole bunch of them, 127 of them, in fact. And you don't have to know all of these events. And to use MIDI, you're probably not going to know or utilize most of these. But there's a few that are kind of good to be aware of because they're control events you would want to use. And the most important ones are actually right here. Volume, balance, and pan. just like you would with an audio file and mixing, MIDI has all the controls to say, like, play this loud, or play on this side, or pan to whichever part that you want. So those three controller events you will use if you use MIDI, because you'll want to adjust that stuff. And an expression event is an interesting one, because when you're listening, you'll probably confuse expression and volume. They both do the same thing, but they do them in different ways. The volume event does actually change the level of the sound as you change it from 0 to 127. At 0, there's no volume. At 127, there's maximum volume. And everywhere you shift, it shifts it down an increment. Expression doesn't expression has the same effect. It makes things quieter and louder, but it doesn't do it by changing the volume of the sound. It does it by the expression of the hit. So just like the softer I hit the key, the quieter it is. That's expression at its loudest. So expression does it by the impact, the level of the key hit. And it's better to actually use expression. Me, I don't like when MIDI programmers use volume. They're it's cleaner doing expression events, and you don't end up messing up the volume on the track, because if you don't set your volume back after you move the volume on a track, sometimes it doesn't reset, and you could have a instrument track that all of a sudden you can't hear because it's at 0 because it had a fade out. And with expression, everything resets at the when it restarts. So I would always go with expression between those two. And then these other events, most of these, a keyboardist might play around with the modulation wheel and breath. If I was, playing with one of those digital horns, I'd certainly like to see what that does. The foot pedal, uh, that's a lot like on pianos. Anybody who plays piano or an organ, where you've got those slider pedals, that's where you can control things like that. Or in the case of a guitar, it's not much different than, say, like a whammy bar. Portamento and these other ones here are just basically specific ones, that, again, you're not likely to ever use or even need to know about. Hold pedal, that's where you would get your sustain and things like that. Uh, Same with all these other pedals. They're all just variations of different ways of muting and holding things. And most of these other events. Now, these two are interesting here. Actually, there's three: the reverb level, the tremolo, and the chorus. Those are actual effects. So, one interesting thing with MIDI is it does come with some basic effects, and those are it right there: the reverb and the chorus. Me personally, whenever I have a MIDI file, the first thing I do is I go in and I turn off all those effects, because I like to use my own. I don't want wet tracks. I like to bounce a dry version of a track. And if I use effects, it's the effects built into my keyboard or the ones that I use in Cakewalk. So the goal is, when I start, is to clean out any of that stuff. I neutralize the choruses, I neutralize the reverbs, I center all the tracks, I set all the levels to 100, which is 75% ish, and then start bouncing tracks. After the tracks are bounced, then I bring up the mixer and start to do all the post production. So, other than those events, all these other ones don't tend to get used too often. These are special ones for just like killing the synth real quick. Because sometimes you might get a stuck note in the MIDI world. It was more common in the old days. Nowadays, the synthesizers have gotten really good. But in the old days, sometimes you needed to use a quick kill to just stop the synthesizer because it wouldn't turn off. So these couple of events down here are just quick ways of like resetting all the equipment. But with all those controller events, that's how all the non-note things going on in a MIDI track. When I was playing here, it wasn't just recording my keys that I was playing. It was recording how hard and whether I slid. You know, things that you can do with the keyboard. The controller events were keeping track of that information. These other events here, program change is the other one that's kind of important here. Um, in the MIDI world, you set your synthesizer to different sounds. The rules with MIDI are there's 16 channels. If I bring this synthesizer up here, let's take a look. I'll bring up a clean project. And I'm going to show you the Cakewalk synthesizer. It's called the TTS. This is a soft synthesizer. This is a software synthesizer. And the way that you bring it in, you insert, and instead of inserting an audio or MIDI track, I insert a soft synth. And if you go down here to the, I think they put it under general MIDI. Yeah. This comes with Cakewalk. And if you have nothing else and you just want to start learning MIDI, get Cakewalk. It's free. You're all on BandLab. By all means, use it. It's free. This synthesizer is a general MIDI synthesizer. It actually has decent sounds, worth at least starting out. And I'm going to insert it into this project. And to open it up, you click on these little icons here. That'll bring up the software synthesizer that you insert. So this is the Cakewalk TTS. Kind of looks like a mixer, but you'll notice there's 16 channels here. And each one of these channels can be set to a different sound. This one, they're all set to piano right now. But, you know, you can make channel 2, I want it to be an organ. You know, channel 3, let's make it a guitar. So the MIDI specs, the way that MIDI works is it will talk to 16 channels on any MIDI synthesizer. A MIDI synthesizer will have 16 channels that you can send a track to. So the bass can go to track 3, the organ can go to track 2, and piano can go to track 1 in this case. And each one of the MIDI tracks would play these instruments. And for the most part, any track can be any sound. The only exception, there's one global rule in MIDI. Track 10 is always for drums. And there's a reason for that, because drum sounds are not like other sounds. All these other sounds, piano, organ, these are all samples. When you're dealing with the sample, each place you hit, that's just a higher octave of a sample. When you're dealing with a drum kit, though, a drum kit is a multi-sample sound. You could be hitting, you know, one key and it's a bass drum. You hit another key, it's a snare. For a multi-sample sound, it has to be handled differently. And in the MIDI world, drum kits talk on channel 10. Channel 10 has been specially programmed to deal with drum kits. And you'll notice that, like, even though all these are piano, channel 10 is set to a drum set because these are drum kits. You could use an instrument sound on channel 10, but if there's a track out there that's set for drums, you might not hear like a melody. You might hear dong 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 dong, because drum keys are not the same as instrument keys. They're mapped. Those are mapped patches. Everything else is just like a standard sample. And with Cakewalk, you get this built-in synthesizer. It has what they call the general MIDI sound set, which is actually 128 banks of sounds. You see a lot more here, but the whole way that general MIDI works is you have 128 sounds, all the different kinds of sounds you would expect to hear couple of pianos, a couple of organs, um, guitars, all these different categories. They're all set to certain numbers, and you'll see actually here, like one. Notice these numbers all correlate to something. So these variations of piano, why are they all four? Because in a general MIDI world, patch number 4 is a honky tonk type of piano. And guitars, a nylon guitar is patch 25, always in a general MIDI setup. Doesn't mean you can't use. My Roland has thousands of sounds, so I go past 127 with my sounds, but my general MIDI setup is compatible with this. The first 127 do match these numbers. 29 is a funk guitar. 31 is a distortion guitar. Not a very good one, but that's why I always go to my guitars instead of using the general MIDI patches. But the nice thing is that with general MIDI, you can literally go on to Google, search for a song, download it, load it into Cakewalk, and Cakewalk will automatically load the proper sounds. If it's supposed to be a fretless bass, Cakewalk will set it to a fretless bass. If it's supposed to be a steel string, Cakewalk will set it. Because of these events that I was talking about here, these program change events. That's how a MIDI file tells channel 1 to be a piano, channel 2 to be a guitar. And you basically have like a 16 channel multi-track synthesizer and a way to talk to it. That's what's cool about MIDI is you're like ready to do multiple instruments. It's designed for it. And then these other two events, again, channel aftertouch and pitch bend. These are the kinds of things that you tend to do more after the fact, when you want to do a slide or something, pitch bend. Just like a guitarist with a whammy bar. So those are the controller events, and that's how MIDI works. Um, when you hear somebody say like, "Oh, that sounds MIDI-ish," or like, "I don't like the sound of it. It sounds like MIDI." When they describe something they're hearing and they use the term MIDI to describe it, you should question them, or you should at least ask them why they think MIDI sounds like something, because it shouldn't. It's not making the sound, it's telling the synthesizer that makes the sound what to play. And that's why I was a little confused by BandLab's question. So I hope that anybody who did answer in there that just confused me more might catch this at some point, or eventually learn like what MIDI is and does. And when somebody asks them if they prefer MIDI or a synth, their answer should be both. They go hand in hand. I couldn't have done anything that I showed you here without a synth. I could use the Cakewalk synth, I can use my Roland synth, but I needed to use a synth because the MIDI by itself isn't sound. So I couldn't play anything for you unless I had a synth to play it. That's why their question wasn't a good way to teach people about MIDI. And I think that was their goal. I think BandLab's trying to get more people into it. They're realizing that a lot of people love their online software and they're using it. But I think it's important, BandLab, that you encourage people to learn what MIDI is rather than encourage the wrong kind of thinking about it. Uh, don't ask them whether they like MIDI or a synth. Ask them what synth do they like with their MIDI. That would have been a better way to question that, and it would have encouraged people to use the term MIDI in a way that makes more sense, and not in a descriptive way, which people have started to do, which is one of the things we were joking about in the comments on that post, was, people who use it as a descriptive term to say, "Oh, your track sound MIDI." When people use terms that way, it doesn't help them to be taken serious by those who take this stuff seriously. You wouldn't go to an orchestra and say, "Oh, those violins sound like sheet music." You wouldn't. You could say the violinist sounds like shit, but you wouldn't say the violinist sounds like sheet music. So you shouldn't say that a song sounds like MIDI, because MIDI is sheet music also. It's just digital sheet music. So hopefully that makes sense to everybody. And I will be doing some more MIDI stuff. I've had some people ask me about doing some tutorials on the bouncing and the exact process, going from the MIDI track to the audio track. And I'll probably do those as pre-record because they can take 5-6 hours. That's my typical time mixing a track. So all you who ask me for a request, that's why it takes me some time before I can get to them. And I have a pile of them waiting. So um, hopefully you're patient. And I do try to get to the ones in my request list in a reasonable amount of time. Sometimes it can take a couple months, but if you do want to hear something, don't be afraid to send me a PM and let me know what you're looking for. If it is something easier and that I can bounce quick, sometimes I will put stuff ahead if I can do a quick kill. So, for those of you who do follow me over my Phantom Tonus channel or Karaoke Therapy, because that's where I put all my tracks for people to jam on, you can always message me over there at Karaoke Therapy 1, and that's the best place to send the request to. I'll keep an eye on that for that. So, I hope everybody got a chance to understand some of this MIDI stuff and make a little sense out of it. I would definitely like to play with that at Kai later on when you've got some time there, Seeds, and I can show you some cool things to do with that. And anybody else who has a MIDI controller and has been hesitant to do anything with it up to this point or doesn't know what the hell they can do with it, you know, let me know and maybe we can bring you on and we'll take one of the shows and show you how to hook it up and get it talking to these synthesizers. It's not that hard. So, all of you, I hope you guys have a good night. And this was our inaugural of Talkin Shhh IT. And hopefully we'll see lots more of that. So, good night, everyone.